My name is Julie, and I'm 74 years old. As I sit here reflecting on my life, I feel like I've lived two completely different versions of it. The first version was one where I kept everything inside, suppressing my emotions and hoping they'd go away. The second, which I'm living now, is one where I've learned to face my emotions head on, to release them in healthy ways, and to let them guide me instead of controlling me. But it took me a long, long time to get here. And let me tell you, the road wasn't easy. If you had met me in my 40s, you might have thought I had everything figured out. On the outside, my life looked perfect. I was married to Tom, my high school sweetheart, and we had two wonderful kids. I worked as a teacher at the local elementary school, a job I loved, even if it was exhausting at times. We had a cozy house, a good circle of friends, and family get-togethers that were always filled with laughter and love. But what you wouldn't have seen was the storm raging inside me. You wouldn't have known about the nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was failing at everything. You wouldn't have known about the silent tears I cried in the shower or the anger that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to boil over. I didn't let anyone see those parts of me, not even Tom. I thought if I could just hold it all together, if I could just keep smiling and pretending everything was fine, then eventually it would be fine. The truth is, I grew up in a family where emotions weren't something you talked about. My parents were good people, kind, hardworking, and devoted to their children, but they weren't exactly warm and fuzzy. If I got upset as a child, my mom would say, "Oh, Julie, don't cry, you're stronger than that." If I was angry, my dad would tell me to cool it or stop making a scene. I learned early on that showing my feelings wasn't safe, so I stopped doing it. By the time I reached adulthood, I was an expert at hiding my emotions. I could smile through anything, a bad day at work, a fight with Tom, even the grief of losing my mother when I was 32. I thought I was doing the right thing, that being stoic and keeping my feelings to myself made me strong. But what I didn't realize was that those emotions didn't just disappear. They stayed with me, buried deep down, and they started to manifest in ways I couldn't ignore. It started in my late 40s. At first, it was little things, tension, headaches that would come and go, an upset stomach after particularly stressful days. I brushed them off, blaming them on work or a bad meal, but over time the symptoms got worse. By the time I hit my 50s, I was dealing with chronic migraines that left me bedridden for hours. My shoulders and neck were so tight that I felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on them, and no amount of stretching or massages seemed to help. I developed acid reflux that made eating certain foods a nightmare, and I had bouts of IBS that left me embarrassed and miserable. The worst part was the fatigue. No matter how much sleep I got, I felt exhausted all the time. I'd wake up in the morning and think, is this really how I'm supposed to feel for the rest of my life? It was like I was running on empty and I didn't know how to refill my tank. I started seeing doctors, hoping they could figure out what was wrong with me. They ran all sorts of tests, blood work, MRI, you name it, but everything came back normal. "You're in great health for your age," they'd say, smiling as if that was supposed to make me feel better. One doctor suggested I might be experiencing perimenopause, and another said it was probably stress. "You've got a lot on your plate," he told me. "Try to relax more." Relax more, it sounded so simple, didn't it? But I didn't know how. I'd spent my entire life bottling up my feelings, keeping everything locked inside, and now it was like my body was screaming at me to stop. But I didn't know where to begin. The breaking point came when I was 63. Tom and I were on a road trip driving through the Smoky Mountains, one of our favorite places in the world. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the hills, and Tom was humming along to the radio. It should have been a perfect moment, one of those memories you look back on with a smile. But out of nowhere, I felt a wave of sadness so overwhelming that it took my breath away. I started crying, big heaving sobs that I couldn't control. Tom pulled the car over, panic written all over his face. "Julie, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I wanted to answer him, but I couldn't. I didn't have the words to explain what I was feeling because I didn't even understand it myself. All I knew was that it felt like a dam had broken inside me and years, decades of bottled-up emotions were pouring out all at once. That moment was my wake-up call. I realized that I couldn't keep living like this, carrying the weight of so many unspoken feelings. I had to make a change, not just for my health, but for my sanity. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. So I made a decision that would ultimately change my life. I reached out for help. After that day in the car, I knew something had to change. When we got home, I started looking for help. At first, I wasn't sure what I needed. Was it a doctor, a support group, or something else entirely? Eventually, after some urging from Tom, I decided to try therapy. I'll admit I was reluctant. The idea of spilling my deepest thoughts to a stranger seemed overwhelming, not to mention unnecessary. I'd always thought of myself as someone who could handle things on my own, but deep down, I knew I couldn't keep going the way I had been. I still remember my first session with Dr. Harper. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an office filled with plants and cozy furniture. The moment I sat down, she smiled warmly and said, "Julie, this is your space. You can say whatever you want here and it will stay between us." At first, I didn't know what to say. I felt awkward and self-conscious, like a kid being called to the principal's office. But Dr. Harper had a way of asking questions that gently nudged me toward opening up. "What brought you here today?" she asked. I started talking about the physical symptoms I'd been experiencing, the migraines, the stomach issues, the constant fatigue. But as I spoke, I found myself veering into deeper territory. I told her about the sadness I'd felt on that road trip, the feeling that something inside me had cracked open. I talked about how I'd always been the strong one in my family, the one who held everything together while silently falling apart. And before I knew it, I was talking about things I hadn't thought about in years, like the way my parents dismissed my feelings when I was a child, or the guilt I carried from an argument I'd had with my sister before she passed away. Dr. Harper listened without interrupting, her expression soft and understanding. When I finally stopped talking, she said something that stuck with me. "Julie, it sounds like you've been carrying a lot of unspoken pain for a long time. Emotions don't just go away when we ignore them, they find other ways to make themselves known, often through our bodies. What you're feeling isn't unusual and it's not your fault, but it's also not permanent. You can heal from this." That was the first time anyone had framed my physical symptoms as being connected to my emotions. It was a revelation and it made so much sense. For years, I'd been suppressing my feelings, convincing myself they didn't matter. But all along, they'd been building up inside me, manifesting as headaches, stomach problems, and exhaustion. Therapy became a lifeline for me. Week after week, I went back to Dr. Harper's office, and each time I felt like I was peeling back another layer of myself. I talked about the pressure I felt to be perfect, the resentment I'd been carrying toward Tom for things I'd never voiced, and the fear I had of getting older and becoming irrelevant. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of sessions where I left feeling emotionally drained, my eyes puffy from crying. But there were also moments of clarity, moments where I felt like I was finally starting to understand myself. Around the same time, I started journaling. Dr. Harper had suggested it as a way to process my emotions between sessions, and I decided to give it a try. Every morning, I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an old notebook, and I'd write whatever came to mind. Sometimes it was just a list of things that had been bothering me. Other times, it was a letter to someone, Tom, my kids, even my younger self, that I'd never actually send. Journaling became a sacred ritual for me. It was a way to release emotions in real time instead of letting them fester. When I wrote, I didn't censor myself or worry about how my words would sound. I just let everything spill out onto the page, raw and unfiltered. And in doing so, I found a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. But therapy and journaling were just the beginning. As I started to unpack my emotions, I realized I needed to work on being present in my daily life. For so long, I'd been stuck in my own head, replaying past mistakes or worrying about the future. I wanted to learn how to be in the moment, to actually experience my life instead of just going through the motions. That's when I discovered mindfulness. At first, I was skeptical. Sitting quietly and focusing on my breath didn't seem like it would do much for me, but I decided to give it a try. Every evening, I'd set aside 10 minutes to sit in a quiet room, close my eyes, and pay attention to my breathing. Inevitably, my mind would wander, and I'd start thinking about what I needed to make for dinner or whether I'd remembered to pay the electric bill. But instead of scolding myself, I'd gently bring my focus back to my breath. Over time, mindfulness taught me something profound. Emotions aren't good or bad, they just are. When I felt sadness, I didn't try to push it away or distract myself. I let myself feel it. When I felt anger, I didn't bury it, I acknowledged it. And in doing so, I found that these emotions lost their power over me. They were no longer things to be feared or avoided, they were just part of being human. As I became more mindful, I started to notice changes in my body. My migraines became less frequent, my stomach issues started to improve, and I began sleeping better at night. But the biggest change wasn't physical, it was emotional. I felt lighter, freer, and more at peace with myself than I ever had before. One of the most surprising things I discovered during this journey was how much my relationships improved. For years, I'd avoided difficult conversations with Tom and the kids because I didn't want to upset them. But I realized that by keeping things inside, I wasn't protecting them. I was only isolating myself, so I started opening up. I told Tom about the resentment I'd been carrying, about how I sometimes felt unappreciated or taken for granted. I was nervous about his reaction, but to my surprise, he listened. Really listened. And instead of getting defensive, he apologized and asked how he could do better. It was a turning point for us, and it brought us closer together. I also had honest conversations with my kids about my struggles. I told them about my health issues and how I was working on healing, both physically and emotionally. To my surprise, they opened up to me in return, sharing their own challenges and fears. Those conversations deepened our bond in a way I hadn't thought possible. As I continued my journey, I realized that emotional healing wasn't a destination, it was a process, one that required ongoing effort and self-awareness. Even now at 74, I still have moments when old habits creep in, when I catch myself holding back tears or biting my tongue instead of speaking up. But the difference is I recognize it now. I've learned to pause, take a breath, and ask myself, what am I really feeling? One of the biggest lessons I've learned is the importance of community. For so long, I'd tried to handle everything on my own, believing that vulnerability was a sign of weakness. But as I began opening up to the people around me, I discovered just how much strength there is in connection. I joined a local women's group that met once a week to talk about everything from family dynamics to personal growth. At first, I was hesitant, I wasn't sure I'd fit in, and I worried about sharing too much. But those women became my lifeline. We laughed together, cried together, and supported each other through life's ups and downs. They taught me that I wasn't alone in my struggles and that sharing your story can be one of the most powerful forms of healing. I also reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. I invited them over for tea or lunch, and we reminisced about the past while catching up on the present. Those conversations reminded me of the joy that comes from simply being seen and heard by someone who truly knows you. One of the most surprising benefits of releasing my emotions was how much more energy I had. It was as if the weight I'd been carrying for decades had been lifted, leaving me free to fully engage with life. I started taking long walks in the park, breathing in the fresh air and noticing the little things I'd overlooked before: the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the way sunlight filters through the trees. I even discovered a love for painting, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. At first, I was self-conscious about my skills or lack thereof, but I quickly realized that painting wasn't about perfection, it was about expression. I poured my emotions onto the canvas, letting colors and shapes speak for the things I couldn't put into words. It became one of my favorite ways to process my feelings and stay connected to myself. Another powerful tool I discovered was forgiveness. For years, I'd carried resentment toward people who had hurt me, as well as guilt over my own mistakes. But through therapy and self-reflection, I began to understand that holding on to those feelings was only hurting me. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing bad behavior or forgetting the past. It meant choosing to let go of the pain and move forward with an open heart. Forgiving others wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. I reached out to an old friend I'd fallen out with years ago, and we had a long, tearful conversation that ended with both of us feeling lighter. I also worked on forgiving myself for the times I'd let fear hold me back, for the words I'd left unspoken, for the mistakes I'd made as a wife and mother. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything I've been through, I feel a deep sense of gratitude. I'm grateful for that moment in the car all those years ago, even though it was painful because it forced me to confront the things I'd been avoiding. I'm grateful for the people who supported me on this journey: Tom, my kids, my therapist, my friends. And most of all, I'm grateful for the person I've become. At 74, I feel more alive than I ever did in my younger years. I've learned that emotions aren't something to be feared or suppressed. They're a natural, essential part of being human. By facing them head on and finding healthy ways to release them, I've not only healed my body but also my soul. If there's one piece of advice I'd offer to anyone reading this, it's this: stop hiding your emotions. They don't go away just because you ignore them. Instead, they build up, finding ways to seep into your body and mind until you're forced to confront them. But you don't have to do it alone. Talk to someone you trust, a therapist, a friend, a family member, and don't be afraid to ask for help. Journaling, mindfulness, and creative outlets like painting have been invaluable tools for me, but the most important step was simply allowing myself to feel. To cry when I needed to cry, to laugh when I felt joy, to speak up when something was bothering me. It's a practice, one I'll continue for the rest of my life. So wherever you are on your journey, know this: it's never too late to start. Whether you're 24 or 74, you have the power to heal, to grow, and to live a life that feels authentic and fulfilling. It won't always be easy, but I promise you it's worth it. And if I can do it, so can you.